Do we have to stop eating fish? That is the solution that the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy has. But today's lecturer, Professor Simon Bush, thinks we shouldn't. Hello, everyone. Welcome at the Sustainable Fishing Seaspiracy lecture by Professor Simon Bush. Good to have you here in the room, and also the people watching the live stream. Welcome. My name is Lenja Slierendrecht, and I work as a program maker for Studium Generale, and I organize lectures with my colleagues, but also film screenings and open stage nights. So if you're curious or want to join something else that we do, follow us on social media through SG Erasmus. Today we are gathered here for an important topic, namely the fishing industry, because there are every day more than a few missteps at sea. But what is going wrong in the industry? Corruption, lack of control on open waters, huge demands since the whole world started eating sushi. The professor who can tell us all about industrial fishing is Simon Bush. He is professor and chair of the Environmental Policy Group at Wageningen University, and his main area of research focuses on the design of governance arrangements for global sustainable seafood. If you have any questions for the professor, please keep them in mind, because after the lecture there will be plenty of room to ask it to him. And from home, if you have questions, please use the comment section on YouTube, then I will ask your question for you. We organized this event together with the Sustainability Hub, and it's here represented by Laura Kolenbrander. Maybe you can come and join me. Because before I give the floor to Simon Bush, I will hand over the microphone to Laura for a short introduction on what the hub actually is.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lenja. Yes, I saw already some familiar faces, actually. Very good, because my name is Laura. I'm from the Erasmus Sustainability Hub, and I'm the general events manager there. I just wanted to introduce you to the hub, basically, because we do a lot of events all regarding to sustainability. And if you would like to become a member, you still can. You can go to our socials. You can even become an active member, because we also have loads of initiatives going on, actually. So, for instance, we have a food committee that you can join, food and agriculture. We have a lot of fashion events going on as well. We do a lot of events with the SDGs as well. So if that interests you, you can actually find us. We're located on the right side of the Mandeville building on the ground floor. So you can actually come and find us there. And yeah, enjoy this lecture with Simon Bush. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And then I would like to ask you to give a warm applause to Professor Simon Bush. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lenja. Seaspiracy, indeed. I think the first thing we should ask for those here in the room, and I think I can still see you through the lights, how many people have seen the documentary? Now, that's the audience you want, right? More or less everybody. A couple of hands didn't go up. Good. So we're talking to I'm talking to an informed audience. It was an interesting thing in the introduction that Simon Bush thinks you should eat fish. Well, that goes a bit too far. Should is always a difficult thing. I wouldn't say anyone should do anything, but we are indeed going to talk about the conclusion of the film, Seaspiracy, and all of you know, we don't have to give away the punchline here, right? All of you know what that answer is. But let me run you through, indeed, also for those at home and watching online, what this film is all about. The film is really what it says on the slide, right? It's an expose. It's made by an apparent filmmaker who stumbles across this issue of unsustainability at sea. And that's really the genre, if you like, right? There's a filmmaker who asks some questions, some simple questions about should I eat fish? Can I eat fish conscionably? And the answer is, well, no. And the answer to that is not just no, the answer is, well, actually, you should become a vegan. But behind that question really is this statement, right? An expose exposing the fishing industry. And that's an interesting starting point, because for a lot of people around the world, there was not really anything exposed by these films. There's lots of issues that are well known. But for a general audience, that was the impression you get when you watch the film. So, what was the other major sort of lines in the film, where there's a lot of statements that make up this film, and I'll go into those a little bit later. But this is one of the most recurring statements around unsustainable fishing, or the fishing industry in general, and I'll get into where it comes from later. But what is it, 2048? If you guys can see that very well, I'm not sure. But empty oceans by 2048. These very apocalyptic visions of fishing and the damage that fishing can do. And I think that is really another major theme that runs through this film. It brings across a very indeed apocalyptic vision around what's happening at the oceans, and of course putting the blame very firmly on those that interact with the seafood industry. It's not just fishing, of course you've seen it, so you know it's also aquaculture. Seafood in general as a very apocalyptic, let's say, food production system. And as we know what the answer is: go vegan. And I think it's also interesting to note, we have to be aware of what we're watching, right? As critical viewers, we have to be aware that indeed this was funded by vegan activists. They knew what they were presenting. They knew they wanted to bring across a message, building on a previous film, Seaspiracy, looking at the beef industry. They moved to the seafood industry with that same message. The only way to eat responsibly in terms of animals is to simply not eat them. Now that's a choice. That's a choice. Everyone has that choice. Going back to the statement that I think you should eat fish, no, I think you should be able to have a choice of eating fish, right? And for some of us, there is a choice. And for many of us in the world, there isn't a choice as to whether you want to or should stop eating this particular source of nutrition, protein and nutrition. These are the sort of headlines that I'm going to talk about in the rest of this lecture. It's also good to pause, I think, on what you're actually watching again when you watch a Netflix film. And maybe I'll put this in context. There's been a number of critical films around the fishing industry, and I think that always, in any sector, there should be critical films made, right? That's good journalism, good documentary making. The difference this time, well, there's a few differences, but one of the differences in terms of the reach and the scope of people that were reached, have watched this film, was really this Netflix thing, right? This is a film that went around the world in the matter of a week. And that, I think, in terms of, well, the seafood, I can't speak for other industries, but in terms of the seafood industry, you really start to see, like never before, these themes and issues really being brought to the public through this platform, this global platform, which I find is very interesting. And you'll see it indeed in a number of other documentaries they have, whether it's about avocados or beef, the same things we see, this rapid platformization of messaging around essentially environmental issues. You could even go so far as to say sort of a green populism around the world. So that's also a context which, as a social scientist working on governance issues, I find particularly interesting in this broader scope, right? What's this film? Where does this film position itself in a broader debate? And whatever I go on to say now, I think it's the one thing that this film has really managed to do is really to bring these discussions out. That I'm invited here to speak to you wouldn't have come about if Seaspiracy wasn't there, right? So talking about these things and providing a platform for discussing these things is a positive outcome of a film like this. But as I'll get into, when a film's made like this, of course, it's very important that the facts are used the right way, right? And as so far as we know in a scientific process, what are the issues and what, therefore, are the kinds of decisions we should base in terms of solutions can we base those answers on. Now, before I look at the other side of the screen there, it's not just the Netflix part of this, but it's also, and this is where I started to really get quite interested in this film. I saw, the film on Netflix. I hadn't watched it at the time, and all of a sudden I start really seeing all these celebrities starting to also make claims, very general claims, there's no way I'm ever going to eat seafood again, stop eating seafood, be a vegan. There's various claims being made. And also through the power of social media, you see the reach of this message being amplified substantially beyond Netflix. Noting again that I didn't see the film, but I had seen through the Linda magazine this Fish for Fungus, so a replacement for your fish. What will you do if you can't eat fish? Well, here are some great ideas. and various other popular magazines, but also indeed on these social media platforms and celebrities, the celebritization of these environmental issues being played out to really a substantial following, right? Some of these individuals on the screen, 4.1 or so million, I think Sir Paul McCartney has in terms of followers. And I think this is one of the Kardashians, right? Kourtney Kardashian, 115 million followers. So the sort of amplification of this message, again, is quite impressive, and all built again on this new world we live in, I should say. But indeed, we could talk about this as in terms of sort of mass-mediated sustainability, right? We all have an opinion around what sustainable is, and if you really look at what sustainability is, it is imperfectly measurable, right? We haven't got any single measure that we can apply to sustainability. Does that mean that things like sustainable fishing and sustainable aquaculture can't be defined as the film claims? Well, no, I don't go that far. Imperfectly measurable doesn't mean measurable. There's a measurable element to sustainability, and we can, in various ways, make those measurements. But there's also a very normative, even emotive side of sustainability, and that's what opens the broad subject up indeed to public debate, and quite emotional public debate. And what was also interesting in this particular film, the case of this film, is that we saw indeed, let's call them the celebrities, really amplifying to their followers on the basis of Netflix, don't eat fish, become a vegan in some instances. But you also saw a number of self-proclaimed experts emerging around the film saying, no, this is rubbish, this is a bunch of lies, for a number of reasons. And if you go indeed on YouTube, you'll be able to find any number of films sort of counteracting these statements that are made in Netflix. But there was also, and the community I belong to, the scientific community, also came out, which I found very interesting, almost unanimously against this film. And again, that brings it back what I started with. There is indeed a lot of concern and existing concern around the seafood industry, fishing and farming. And there's a whole bunch of scientists around the world who normally really don't agree with everything each other says. In this particular moment came together and said, well, okay, let's have this debate. We're glad that the debate is there because the film has been made, but now let's have the debate on the basis of the current science. And let's just not do it with scientists. Let's also speak to the NGOs that have been busy with this, that very large number of NGOs that have been busy with sustainable seafood issues for a number of years as well. Let's go into discussion with them. Some of them, of course, were highlighted in the film, were not portrayed in a very positive light in the film. In fact, many colleagues that I have working in the NGO sector have said this film has put us 20 years back in terms of our engagement with the fishing industry and the aquaculture industry. Because what is it doing? It's creating polarization. It's not creating a bridge for engagement. It's not creating a bridge for discussion. It's pushing people into a corner where the advocates, the NGO advocates around sustainability are finding their work more difficult, and the scientists are frustrated that the work that we're doing collectively perhaps isn't given the same kind of platform that a film on Netflix can gain in a very short time. So that's where you see a number of different opinions coming together, some scientific, some more societal claims and concerns, which is very fair, but they're not coming together in a very positive, I would say, reinforcing, engaging way. We're not in discussion with each other through this film. And what were some of the claims that were made? Well, we can run through them. Misleading statements. Well, again, I can talk to some of those misleading statements in some of the following slides. Privileged solutions is one of the other things that we hear if you look around in terms of the critiques of this film. Privileged in the sense where we started with again, what is the choice? Should we not eat fish, or do you have the choice not to eat fish? Well, I would say again, that's a very privileged position, and I'll get to that towards the end of the lecture tonight. Unethical interviews. Yeah, well, I've spoken to some journalist colleagues about this who work in the industry, and they're really quite shocked about the way that certain interviews were conducted. Also seeing direct colleagues who are actually interviewed in the film, a 2-hour interview, and you have one line or 15 seconds of that interview actually put into the film. So there are some concerns being voiced around how the film was made. And we can go to misleading statements, but there's also indeed just flat out inaccuracies. And again, I'll run through a few of those in some of the slides to follow. And I think I've covered the rest there. I'm really coming to this point of polarization without realistic solutions. And that's really a theme that I want to draw out, and I want to have a discussion with you after the lecture as well. Is this a realistic solution, being a vegan, or should we think differently about this? So having said all of that, we get to this question, right? Did the film say anything good? Am I going to stand here and say that it got everything wrong, that there's no issues at sea? Well, no, I think I've already given you that indication, right? There's a lot in general that they've pointed at which are real concerns at sea, in the seafood industry. I don't think anyone is denying that, right? Anyone in all of the critique, all of the debate that's emerged has not said this film is living on a completely different planet. Not at all. Overfishing exists. What the scale of that overfishing is becomes then the point of discussion. Practices like shark finning, removing top predators from the sea, that's a real concern that a lot of people indeed are busy with. Human rights abuses. We've seen, well, actually for decades, but only in the last 7 to 8 years have we seen a global recognition that there are substantial human rights abuses within the seafood industry. Now, I'm not making an excuse here. It's not only the seafood industry, and it's not, as this film would argue, only in Southeast Asia. It's a global issue, and in the interim, 2013, 2012, when some of the cases became globally recognised, because regionally they were already understood, we've seen a lot of action. And I'll get back to that again in a few slides. Competition between industrial and small-scale fishing, also a fair issue. Aquaculture, related environmental impacts. Again, I'll get into this, but yes, there are some issues associated with aquaculture production. The way the film brings it across is that you have shrimp and you have salmon aquaculture. Actually, there are 345 species which are growing globally along a huge spectrum of production systems. But yes, in general, we should be concerned about aquaculture and the environmental impacts of those production systems. Unsustainable public subsidies. Well, yes, also. There are all kinds of subsidies. There are what you could argue as very positive subsidies, subsidies which go to innovating new sustainable fishing gears, for instance. But there's also damaging subsidies, subsidies which create overcapacity on the sea. Too many boats, right, with too bigger engines, with too bigger nets. That becomes a damaging negative subsidy. And plastics, another really important issue, right? Yes, there's too much plastic in the oceans, absolutely. But you're thinking critically, I hope, and you're thinking, okay, well, I've seen the film, and all of these issues, do they all add up to simply one solution? That's my challenge to you this evening or this afternoon. Feels like the evening, it's dark, right? That's my challenge to you. Does all of this add up to stop eating fish? The world should stop eating seafood. Because that's what they try to do. They bring it all to that. Okay, so even though they're pointing to these issues, again, I'm going to come back to it and we're going to run through them now, right? Major inaccuracies. I can't go through the entire film, but we can talk about issues that I don't cover afterwards if you have any questions, but I can cover, I think I've got 6 points that I want to cover in terms of inaccuracies. Also coming back, and that's a theme I'm already bringing out, I hope you can see that, right? This simple solutionism, the silver bullet answer to a global food system problem. And this rather, perhaps more controversial point of potentially more harm than good. Yes, this film has created debate, but there is other debates going on, and we've just recently had the United Nations Food Systems Summit, where I'll show you at the end, there's really been a focus on the role of seafood, what we've tried to re-term blue food. And we've done that because there is already a very severe lack of recognition lack of data even, you could argue, around the broader impacts and importance of this food, blue food, to providing sustainable livelihoods, to providing important source of global nutrition, and even when seen in the context of a food system, not just focused on aquaculture or fisheries, where we see fish and seafood feeding into a global food system, actually there are some environmentally positive outcomes that can be realised through this industry. Not all forms of production of seafood, but certainly some. And again, linking that back to this simple solutionism, we can almost undermine any of those gains by simply coming up with some simple answers. So let's run through some of these, what I'm calling counterclaims. The first, and that goes back to that slide, which I'm not sure you're able to see, fish stocks are, this is my counterclaim, are not going to collapse by 2048. Not only my counterclaim, there's really a body of science that goes around this counterclaim. Now, where did this statement come from? It comes from a paper by Boris Werman and colleagues, a long list of colleagues in a paper in 2006. Now, this paper was actually focused on biodiversity, and one part of the paper talked about, based on some work they were doing, this modelling work they were doing, that there would be a collapse of biodiversity and a collapse of ecosystems given certain fishing pressures by 2048. Now, that's an alarming statement. And that's a statement that was picked up by the communications departments of those scientists, and that's been reproduced time and time again, as we know, also in the recent Seaspiracy film. Now, this is the running theme also in terms of how science is used in this film. We have a paper in 2006. In the interim, those authors have been very busy. Science doesn't stop. Part of science is also about debating with each other. Right? So apart from the fact this wasn't really the main point of the paper, but was amplified, that's fine. It creates debate. Debate is good. There was really academic conflict, as much as academics get into conflict, around this particular statement. And that led to new collaborations between various universities in the United States and beyond to look at really what is the status of fishing stocks around the world. And that led to data being collected. Because there's one thing, again, another claim in the film, which I'm not going to put on a slide, but another claim is that scientists have no idea how to assess the sustainability of fisheries. That's a science unto itself of how to define sustainability. What are the new ways and techniques that we can assess whether there is fishing mortality that exceeds the biomass in the ocean? That's the F word up here, rather. And indeed, biomass at MSY, maximum sustainable yield. How do you define maximum sustainable yield? There's a whole debate that goes back decades around that as well, but it's a moving target and a moving area of scientific inquiry. So because of this statement, there was a whole bunch of scientists got together and indeed thinking, well, how can we better understand what's going on? We need, indeed, as I said, we need data. We need data that we can use. And when you look around, in that interim period, over that interim period, in fact, over the last 20, 30 years, if we look at where the main databases are, we go to the FAO, right, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And you quickly find out that actually those databases are based on national statistics systems which are very opaque in terms of how they're collecting information. They just simply put numbers, some countries put simply numbers into the database when literally they're called up by the FAO. Other countries have enormous infrastructures designed to collect data around their fisheries at near real-time timescales, almost present-day timescales. So there's a lot of difference in what data is available. But this collection of data to be able to assess the current status has led to various outcomes, one of which is the RAM Legacy database, and a series of papers where we start to see today, and by the time they were making this film, they could have found similar statements that around 50% of global stocks are healthy or increasing. Now that also goes back to classifications, right? If we look at the FAO classifications, you see a few different ones when it comes to the status of stocks. This is brought out by the FAO every year. We have overfished, fully exploited, and underfished. Now, in this film, you saw some people being interviewed saying this is a ridiculous term, underfished. This is an evil term, I think, almost the statement being used, right? Underfished, like there's a resource that we okay, well, that's still, I think, a fair statement, right? We don't have to get into the word usage necessarily, but yes, they're underfished. That's the notion, that's the idea that the FAO puts forward. But underfished and fully exploited. Fully exploited, people often think, well, that's unsustainable. No, that's not unsustainable. Fully exploited means that it's exploited, fully exploited at maximum level, at sustainable levels. That's the assumption, right? That's the assumption. Now, of course, if you dig down, sure, you might find other things. But just on that word categorization, there's some of the problems that we run into. But if we go back and really look at some fishing data, then we do see that 50%, this is based on the work that's been done by a large team of global experts, 50% of global stocks are healthy or in fact are increasing. Now this figure is an interesting one. This is part of the RAM legacy database. And I won't get into we won't do a fishery science lecture today, but all you need to look at is over time we see it moving from this, in your view, this bottom right corner, right? And the concentration seems to come to the middle here. Now, the bottom right corner, that's a pretty healthy place in terms of biomass, right? We see biomass is higher the further we go this way, right? But as fishing pressure, the F, right? The fishing pressure increases, then the biomass reduces, right? And the fishing pressure increases. So that's why you're moving towards this top, in your view, top left corner of the figure. But you'll see over time, through the 60s, the 70s, we see this increase from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. If we go a bit quicker, then you start to see it pushing up into this top left corner. Well, that's a problem, right? Where you want it to be is around that cross, right? Where it's 1 and 1, right? Where we have essentially biomass, which is still reproducing itself, and at a fishing pressure which isn't essentially driving that biomass to an unsustainable level. So that's essentially where we want to be. Now, the other thing you'll see very quickly in that figure is there's huge spread of data, right? That's why actually I like the figure, or I like the animation, because it shows that there are fisheries across a broad spectrum of lots of fishing going on, still lots of biomass, right? That would be that top corner. Well, there's a fishery up there. I don't know which fishery it is, but apparently you can fish really heavy and the biomass isn't being affected. There are some species that can cope with high fishing pressure. If we look at skipjack tuna in the Pacific, for example, fishing pressure has increased and increased and increased, but we still see that particular stock, which is the world's largest fishing stock, actually not moving into an unsustainable region of a figure like this. Other species, you really back down in the bottom corner, well, here, then there's virtually no fishing pressure, but we see biomass really dropping, right? So there's, anyway, all across this figure, there's different positions. Now, again, what I'm trying to illustrate with all of that diversity is that providing one simple statement that the oceans are going to crash becomes nonsense if we really understand the diversity of outcomes and diversity of fishing pressures and biodiversity dynamics. The second point, counterclaim. A third of fish entering the US is not illegal, which is a counterclaim to what is being made in the film, that a third of fish entering the United States is indeed illegal. Now again, there's a scientific background to this. Papers are published by a group in 2014, again in 2017, where they have a particular methodology. They make, as we do as scientists, certain assumptions. The assumption that went wrong there was that 90% of fish that is imported to the US, or rather 90% of the fish that is eaten in the United States is imported. And I won't get into the details there, but based on that, they were able to come with this statement of a third of the fish is illegal. But the amount of fish that's imported has been drastically reduced. So does that mean that no illegal fish enters the United States? Or by extension, the Netherlands? Well, no. There very likely is going to be some illegal fish entering. Is that something we should be concerned about? Absolutely. Now, what the film also doesn't mention is that there's been, over the last 2 decades, enormous efforts made, in particular, I might add, by the European Union through their IUU regulation, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing regulation. This is essentially a multilateral, bilateral mechanism that the European Union puts in place to make sure that whatever fish is entering the EU market has a catch certificate. meaning that that fish, we know where that fish is being caught, we know that it's being caught in an area, therefore is reported. We would like to have the fish also coming from a regulated fishery, that regulations are in place. That's the regulated part. And if those are in place, we also would like that fish to be legal. And that's what that catch certificate communicates. And there's been enormous efforts that have gone into ensuring at a global scale that those systems have been put in place and that we can contribute through the market power, essentially, of the European Union to improve or change the IUU into an LRR, legal, reported and regulated set of fisheries. Now, if a country doesn't live up to that, those requirements set by the EU, then they can receive what is called a yellow card. And if they get a yellow card, it's a warning, just like in football. And if they get a red card, then they're no longer able to sell fish to the European Union. Now, for some countries, that threat has led to enormous change. And there's a list of countries where enormous change has occurred in terms of putting in place regulation, in terms of putting in place traceability, putting in place legislation in some instances around certain fisheries. So that's all in place. The United States also has followed on the EU with their own set of, called SIMP, which is a seafood import regulation, which more or less does the same thing. On top of that, we also see non-governmental actors, groups like Google, which is behind this, but also others, developing things like Global Fishing Watch, which is based on publicly available information of monitoring, and the science of this has expanded dramatically in the last 10 years, monitoring where fishermen are fishing on the high seas, because of course there becomes a bit trickier, right? We're not fishing in the waters of a particular country, so the scope for illegality and unreported, unregulated fishing is assumed to be high, which I think is a fair assumption. Not to say there aren't rules on the high sea, there are. They come through regional fishery management organisations, which are also part of a United Nations Transboundary Fish Stock Agreement. So I'm not throwing these words to impress you. I'm telling you that there are a whole bunch of institutions globally where we do our best to try, we collectively, right, do our best to try and regulate these fisheries. And these non-state actors are providing another layer, which they think is valuable. The jury is out whether this will actually be effective, but really providing an added layer of transparency on what is happening beyond the shores, at sea, to try and map out where fishing pressure is occurring. Counterclaim 3, seafood is full of pollutants. Well, it would be remiss of me to tell you that there's no pollutants in seafood. But at the same time, what this film also misses out on is the fact that seafood is one of the most heavily regulated food products when it comes to food safety. Again, within the European Union, we have a rapid alert system for food in general, and seafood is, of course, a major focus of that. And there's a whole range of, it's not only the European Union, there's a whole range of food and drug administrations in various countries that are aimed at doing the same thing. To make a wholesale claim that all seafood is full of pollutants is simply irresponsible and untrue. Even in the most high-profile cases, where you have, for example, tuna and mercury, high-level predators, where there has been, in some parts of the world, concern over mercury levels. That's fair. There has been concern. But at the same time, there's a difference between hazard and risk. And that becomes a very nuanced but a fundamental statement when it comes to understanding pollutants in any food, let alone seafood. Meaning that we can have all sorts of pollutants in general terms in a food item, but whether or not that poses a risk to those consuming is a whole other question. And that has everything to do with exposure, and everything to do with, just to say that, exposure to those substances. We see the same thing coming back in shrimp, in pangasius. For those of you who might know what pangasius is, this bassa catfish we can buy in the supermarkets. All sorts of claims have been made about that fish. But again, based on research, yes, is there concern around some substances being in these fish? Well, perhaps, but even if you say that it's in there, you'd have to eat, as the research we did, 65 kilograms of that fish every day for a year before you reached a level at which you would then be affected. Now again, is this a scary seafood question? No. This is the way we govern food safety in general terms. But again, these broad statements become not very helpful. In particular because, and that's something I've mentioned already, this nutritional value of this particular source of food. Seafood is one of the most nutritional sources of food that we can eat, and especially if you're a vulnerable community and you don't have access to the same breadth and, let's say, wealth of food choice that we do in places like the Netherlands. Counterclaim 4. Human rights abuses in the seafood industry are real, as I've said already, but are not universal. Now, the history of this statement, I think, is also very interesting because, again, as I've said, in early 2010s, we did see increased awareness that there were labour abuses within the seafood industry. And again, there was a huge, multifaceted response. The European Union coming back to this yellow card, red card system, also knowing that the European Union had a free trade agreement pending with Thailand, had a lot of leverage over Thailand. Now, we can have a whole debate over the relationship between the European Union and countries like Thailand, but this is one of the ways in which change is leveraged. And that essentially led to a whole bunch of changes. A new legislation, fishing legislation, was written in that country. A whole range of changes were made in response. We see supermarkets, a coalition of supermarkets from all around the world saying, well, we don't want to have slavery, seafood slavery in any of our food. And this led, although it started in Thailand, it led to a global search for where these labour abuses could be. Now, again, I'm not saying they weren't there, but I think it's responsible also to tell a public watching Netflix that things have moved on as well. Even the people who were interviewed in that film have been fundamental to the changes, really lobbying and advocating for change. And a review that was just done a couple of years ago that I have on the slide there even says there have been enormous strides taken from a critical group of NGOs, huge strides taken. Of course, then enforcement has to be put in place. Yes, let's focus on those sorts of issues. But let's not talk about wholesale statements, which I have to be honest with you, and it's been a statement which has been passed around also amongst a lot of circles, is that there was a very regional focus of a lot of the anger this film was presenting, really to Asia, and this was an Asian problem. Well, if one thing that was presented, if this one issue illustrates anything, it shows that this isn't an Asian problem. This actually ended up being very much a global problem. We see Hawaii, we see Scotland, we see New Zealand, the United States, all being drawn into these sorts of debates. And that wouldn't have become apparent if we hadn't dived in and some of the measures that have been put in place had not been put in place. The Marine Stewardship Council, you'll remember in the film that they weren't interviewed, and this became quite a useful target, in fact, right, for the filmmakers. Because, as they state, well, on the basis of that not being able to interview them, they were stating that the Marine Stewardship Council receives money directly for giving their label out. Well, that's highly misleading. That's highly misleading. And not really a fair understanding of what the MSC is and what it does and how it operates. What does the Marine Stewardship Council do? Well, it holds standards. It holds, in fact, the only publicly available global standards which define sustainability in the world. Now, my focus of research is governance and seafood governance, and I've been very critical towards a lot of these private standards, the Marine Stewardship Council, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council based here in the Netherlands amongst them. But do I think that the world would be a better place if they weren't there? Absolutely not. It doesn't mean that those institutions can't be improved. Yes, they can absolutely be improved. But the statements here again are misleading because they say that they receive direct payment. Well, they don't. There's a third-party auditing system. There's a system where, indeed, people are paid to go and check if a fishery is performing against the standards that the MSC holds. And if that fishery decides to put a label to demonstrate that certification to a market, to a consumer, then they can pay a licensing fee for that label. But they don't have to use the label. They don't have to. A number of years ago, McDonald's globally decided that they were going to only buy certified whitefish, pollock in fact. But you never saw that label when you went into a McDonald's, right? So there are different, let's say, things going on when it comes to payments and the MSC. And again, they're not there to make money, they're there to hold a standard which can be used to hold fisheries accountable to. Now they also, I think, made a mistake with we know they made a mistake with the fishery that they highlighted, saying that there's a fishery, a lumpfish fishery in Iceland. This was the example they used. And that fishery was had a high degree of bycatch, even of mammals, marine mammals, seals and harbour seals. Yes, that was the case. What they failed to tell you was that that fishery was suspended from the Marine Stewardship Council, and then they fixed a number of issues associated with bycatch, and then they were let back into the program. Now, I think it's good that we ask ourselves, isn't that exactly the mechanism, the theory of change that the Marine Stewardship Council is looking for? And if that organisation wasn't there, what would have been the leverage that anyone would have had over making those changes within a fishery? It might be an imperfect system, but again, we have to be accurate and understand what we're talking about when we're talking about different institutions of sustainability. And the last counterclaim, aquaculture. Well, I think I've already let some of this information out already. I would argue that it's not part of the problem. It has problems, but it's not part of a global problem of seafood. In fact, it's fundamental to, I would argue, any solution we would want to look for to ensure that we can continue to deliver seafood into the future, which can be environmentally sustainable, that can contribute an important degree of nutrition to the world's population, and also be maintained as an important source of livelihoods for many people. Now, okay, against that big background, what are we talking about when we talked about aquaculture? How is that presented in the film? Well, again, there's 25 years of research, which also is rather biased, I might add, towards focusing on environmental issues when it comes to salmon and shrimp. And this film reproduced a lot of that science. Yes, there are issues in those industries. Do we see an improvement in those industries? Yes, also. Actually, enormous gains when it comes to feed, for example, within the salmon industry. We see fish conversion ratios, so the amount of fish which needs to go in to feed to produce a salmon has dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. And we should continue to be very strict and let's say, we should maintain overview of an industry like the salmon industry. But at the same time over the last 20 years, because that's really been the science some of the science that's been done around feeds and feed conversion ratios, at the same time, we've seen an explosion of species. This being 1997, this being 2017, in the number and scope of species being produced. It's exploded. And on the one hand, yes, you do have, let's say, high trophic level, more predator-like fish like salmon being grown. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have seaweeds, we have mussels. That's also aquaculture. And in fact, they can have a net positive benefit to the environment. But of course, this wasn't picked up in the film. So the consequences of single solutions. Well, I would say that, boycotting fish is indeed a choice. Going back to that introduction, should you stop eating fish? I'm going to pick on Lenya here. Well, no, I don't think you should, but you should have the choice, right? And there is a choice. That's the point. There is a choice when it comes to the Netherlands. You have a choice, and that's good. But when we're really talking about the global impact of the seafood industry, again, 3.3 billion people around the world are reliant on seafood for nutrition. That is less of a choice for them to simply stop eating seafood. Now, I've had people giving these talks, people say, well, but hang on, Simon, Netflix is really only a US and EU thing, right? Well, you saw that map at the start, right? It's a global platform, and it really communicated as a global problem. And I don't think this solution is a global solution. So, let me move into the last phase of the lecture, and we can get into some discussion. At the same time, over the last 2 or 3 years, and I said this at the start, we've been working in a coalition, I've been working in a coalition of scientists from around the world on the Blue Food Assessment. Now, the starting point of the Blue Food Assessment is more or less that we need to understand better, collectively, what the contribution is of blue food, of seaweed. And again, when we're talking about blue food, maybe I haven't said this, we're not just talking about fish. Fish is an easy thing to say, right? We're also talking about seaweed. We're talking about crustaceans. We're talking about mollusks. We're talking about frogs. We're even talking about insects. Anything that grows in water, that's a huge diversity, really an enormous diversity, thousands of species, which are currently exploited for food in all sorts of places around the world. So what we wanted to do as a team was to look at various aspects. We looked at climate, we looked at environments, we looked at social justice, we looked at nutrition. We looked at the role of smallholders and their livelihoods. And we looked at transformation. What new policy arrangements, what changes to policy do we need to put in place in order to ensure that not only blue food is recognised, but that we can enhance where it's necessary, enhance the ability of this industry to reproduce itself in a sustainable way, that we realise those benefits into the future. So, one of the first areas we looked at, to sum maybe 3 areas, I'm going to summarise 3 areas. Blue foods can enhance global nutrition. Now, what we see through the work we've done is that global demand for seafood is going to double by 2050. Now, that is also going to be an increase in demand in places like Europe and the United States, but there's in particular going to be an increase in demand in places where that nutritional value is very necessary. Does it mean that nutritional value isn't necessary in places like the Netherlands? Well, I think that's not altogether true as well. In the United States, for instance, they're very much focused now on seeing how vulnerable populations, nutritionally vulnerable populations, can benefit from increasing seafood in their diets. There we can also think of very gendered needs. Women and young children, also pregnant women, needing nutrition, and that nutritional value from seaweed being able to deliver a lot of those needs, those micronutrients. And there's also this statement, potential to reduce consumption of other animal proteins. Now, through that modelling work that was done in this paper, we also see that where into the future, where we are unlikely to see an increase in seafood consumption, we're more likely to see a reduction in other animal proteins. Now, that's an important thing if we're talking not only about seafood, but we're talking about the global food system. Because if we have visvervangers in Dutch, if we say that if we can't eat fish but we're going to eat something else, then I think it's very much an open question as to whether a decision not to eat fish is going to lead you to a vegan diet. What can also be an outcome is that you simply shift proteins. And then we're into a strange situation. Stop eating fish, but increase red meat consumption, for instance. Now, there's a few things going on in places like the Netherlands as well in that sense, because what we see is indeed alternative proteins becoming quite popular. And the assumption is, well, these are going to replace meat protein. Well, we see an increase in both currently, and we can't quite work out why, right? We see an increase in red meat consumption, as well as the alternatives. So it's not a direct path of stopping one thing and eating another. However, still with that modelling work, we see the potential is there to indeed reduce other red meats if seafood is increased. The second major finding of this program was blue foods advance equitable livelihoods. And again, it goes back to that privilege point I was raising before. So blue foods is really the cornerstone of many rural and national economies around the world. 800 million, I think it's even 900 million in fact, livelihoods that are based on this industry, both farmed and wild capture around the world. Small-scale fisheries and aquaculture providing 90% of the jobs in the sector. That's not only the producers, but also the gleaners, the people who take the meat off whatever organism it is, process that, trade that. 90% are small-scale producers who are dependent on this industry for their livelihoods. Then third statement, blue foods can enhance the sustainability of our global food system. Again, based on the work that was done, we see that a whole range of popular aquaculture species, taking that as an example, have the same essentially, or in the same range of the environmental footprint of chicken, which is the largest animal protein consumed, the most prevalent animal protein consumed. Now that puts it on a very different scale to these other animal proteins, nutritionally as we talked about, but also in terms of environmental footprint. And as I said also, these broad categories are unhelpful when we start to think about the potential of other forms of aquaculture, mussels and seaweed, for instance. Now the Netherlands here, we have a mussel industry, has a very important cultural background, but we've seen that the consumption of that mussel has declined over time because younger generations in this country, I'm really talking about the Netherlands, are apparently demonstrating less demand for that food item. Yet, if we put it on an environmental scale, we see a lot of benefits of consuming species groups like that. So if we're talking about transitions, we have to be careful again about what we're talking about, both seafood to non-seafood, but also within the seafood industry itself, and recognizing where we can recognize that there are indeed some systems which can be beneficial. And the last slide, before we get into a discussion. One paper that's still pending is one that I've been leading, and that's really looking at blue food transformations, and it really brings it back to a policy discussion. And won't summarize the paper, but what I want to emphasize from that paper is that we're having a discussion around the role of government policy. We're talking about private standards like MSC or ASC, the Marine Stewardship Council, or the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and we're talking about finance. And what we often see is that there's too much of a reliance on one of those things. Government policy is going to be the solution. If we simply put an incentive for countries to become not IUU but to move to legal, reported and regulated fisheries, then the world will be solved. If only everyone complied with the MSC or ASC standards, then everything would be fine. But what we see is that's none of those are going to be a solution unto themselves. And furthermore, they set goals which can in themselves be very exclusive. All of the effort that's gone into the MSC certification for the last 20 years, more than 20 years now, we only, in inverted commas, have between 15 and 20% of fisheries certified. Now that's a substantial effort unto itself, but they don't even have the ambition of having 100% of fisheries certified because they recognize it's not the right tool for everywhere all the time. Just like the EU's IUU policy isn't going to be the right tool for everywhere all the time. There can also be side effects of the IUU policy of labeling small-scale fisheries as IUU because they're left alone by governments. Governments don't want to regulate them, so they become illegal all of a sudden. So that's also not going to be a tool that has to fit every circumstance all the time. Also, what we see is that we need fundamental changes to the basis upon which production occurs, and that links very closely to finance. And what we're saying in this paper also is we need to move away from just providing goals, performance indicators. What we need to do is think about how standards, states, and finance can reinforce each other to enable new practices, sustainable practices to emerge in the seafood sector. In fact, any food sector. And if we can develop the capabilities of producers and traders, both small scale and large scale, mind you, to make the changes necessary to enhance the ability of this sector to deliver nutritionally valuable and, of course, economically viable seafood, nutritional seafood, then we all win. And I don't think that is captured very well in Seaspiracy, whereas I think that is exactly the debate that is happening at places like the United Nations Food Systems Summit and is certainly the challenge which is being put forward within the scientific community. So I'd like to leave it there, and I look very much forward to any questions you might have.
Much. Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture today.
Pleasure.
I'm very happy with some of the statements that you had a counter statement for. But What I think that was so strong about the Seaspiracy documentary, besides the strong images in the documentary, is also that it's a worldwide, it's a global problem, and it's very hard to grasp your head around. But it had a solution on individual level.
Yeah.
So I can do something to help to solve this problem. Do you have any suggestions that we can do on an individual level besides, I mean, we live in the Netherlands, we can choose to become vegan.
Yeah.
But that's, so after all,
Yeah.
you might have the same conclusion for us, at least.
Yeah. Well, as I said a number of times, becoming a vegan is an option. I don't think people in the Netherlands becoming vegan is actually going to create a lot of solutions for global fisheries and aquaculture in any case. That's a pretty hard statement to say, but I think that really is the case. You'd have to have such a scale of people around the world who are going to make a wholesale change to a different lifestyle choice for it to make a difference to the world's oceans. And the scale of that choice would have to be really very phenomenal. And even then, there are going to be consequences of that. Apart from all the things I've just said, there are consequences. We have to have other sources of food, right? And yes, we can look towards that, but the wholesale transition towards new food systems, that's not a straightforward path. Okay, that's one issue. What can you do if you do want to consume seafood responsibly? Well, they're imperfect systems, but one of the tools we do have are these labeling systems. Now you can say as an individual consumer, I'm going to choose 4 products, right? You can do that, and you're confronted with those choices when you go to restaurants also. When you go to the market, on the market square, you have those choices which aren't always available to you. But you can also use things like wallet cards. The Good Fish Foundation in this country provides you a tool by which you can start asking the right questions to the fishmonger. You can ask and put pressure on them as to where this fish comes from. That's another way you can make a difference. Also recognise, though, when you're going to a supermarket in this country, that there's a long-term debate, relationship, advocacy directed from NGOs to these supermarkets that's been going on for indeed a couple of decades now, where they've got all sorts of pressures. It's not just consumers they're listening to, it's also these NGOs they're very much listening to. And these NGOs have engaged them in practices where they can improve their sourcing, put pressure on their suppliers to reduce, whether it be waste, whether it be sourcing red list species. That doesn't happen anymore, but very much was the case. And moving towards more sustainable products. So they're the sorts of things you can do. But I would also argue, and that's a broader statement, that we can also, linking back to this finance discussion, when you're consuming, you're not only consuming food, you can consume through where you bank, you can consume through where you buy insurance, you can consume through where your pension is once you have a pension. These are all very current debates, if you've perhaps seen that in the Netherlands. Pension funds, for example, they provide finance, and part of that finance goes to food sectors. And some of that finance can also shape more or less sustainable food production, including seafood production. So I would say they're the kinds of layers that as individuals we should be aware of. These markets aren't made up of things out there, they're made up of us. And the institutions that control our finances and our risk, our insurance and our pensions are made up by us. And again, we're starting to see those sorts of movements in the Netherlands just in the last weeks, which I find fascinating.
Thank you. I think there might be questions from the audience. Does anyone want to ask something or add something to a discussion? You can raise your hand if you want. Otherwise, I go to the online questions because there are some.
Completely shell-shocked is everyone, huh?
Okay, there's a question by Sarah, and she asks, how do you evaluate the healthiness of fish produced in aquaculture when there are concerns about the high ratio of antibiotics in the fish?
Yeah. There are concerns about antibiotics, and there's a long history of antibiotics in use in not just seafood, right, but in animal production, and that's a real concern. I think there are 2 different things. There's nutrition, and there's indeed the food safety dimension that I think Sarah's pointing to. all I can say is, really, that there are layers upon layers of food safety assessments which are done over the food we eat. And the consequences of a aquaculture producer in another country sending their food to the European Union and being caught within the rapid alert system are significant, are very significant. If they're banned from, if their code for importing is taken away from them, they're losing access to, by value, the largest seafood market in the world. So it's not that these aren't issues, they are. They're being dealt with by a series of rules and systems that are in place that are designed to reduce, if not minimize, if not eliminate, the risk of food safety concerns in the food system. So indeed, we have to have a degree of trust that those systems are working all the time behind the scenes, delivering us this food. And I can get into other discussions around what I said, this notion between hazard and risk. Now what we see, and I'll go back to this case because I know it the best, the pangasius case, we see certain hazards are reproduced in the media. I've seen them being reproduced in the media for the last 20 years around this fish. But they're talking about the potential risk. They're talking about, well, there could be all sorts of things in this fish. But actually, what does that translate to in terms of a risk? Well, if things get through, if we get some antibiotics that get through the system, if that occurs, then again, we've got to understand the volumes of fish you would have to eat in order for that risk to become a real danger to someone's health is rather large. Now, I think it's important we think in those terms because we have to think critically about a lot of the statements that are put forward around certain species.
Thank you. We have a question here in the second row. Oh, one moment. My colleague is coming with a microphone so that the online audience can hear you too.
Yes. How much more sustainable do you think is farmed fishing compared with locally sourced fishing? Oh no, yeah, farmed fishes, I mean. For example, we are all Western consumers, and all those farmed fishes and crustaceans need to be imported from, for example, Africa or Asia. Wouldn't it be much more sustainable to get our fish from the North Sea, for example?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. It's a good question, and it's a complicated question also. So if we're talking about not importing any seafood and only eating seaweed and mussels from the North Sea, then you'd have a pretty good case that that's going to be a pretty sustainable choice, absolutely. But we also see, and I'll go back to another example, where we see again with pangasius as produced in Vietnam. We saw a few years ago, for instance, another claim that was made against this fish in Belgium, and the claim was that exactly this, that this is unsustainable because of the carbon footprint, and that these supermarkets should not engage in this fish at all because of the carbon footprint. They should instead buy fish from the North Sea. They should instead buy fisheries, actually ground fish from the North Sea, meaning fish that are on the bottom of the ocean. Now that requires trawlers, right? So there are environmental impacts with that, but even if you bring it back to a CO2 impact, what was demonstrated in the aftermath of that particular case is that the per unit CO2 footprint of a pangasius, even though it comes from Vietnam, is actually lower than the fish which was produced in that particular instance from the North Sea. So again, I don't think it's a matter of saying only local fish is always more sustainable than globally produced and traded fish. That becomes a very difficult proposition. If you look at the scale at which tuna is produced, yes, there's a carbon footprint, but if we also talk about, what are the alternatives if people are not going to eat that fish, they're going to eat something else, then we get into another very interesting debate. And a debate we should have, right, on what the carbon footprint is of different foodstuffs, but we should look at it in a rational way. We should try to base it on information rather than making claims and let those claims lead. So yes, absolutely, we should look critically, and in some instances local food may be better, in other instances it may not be. And also I think just seafood, or indeed bringing it out to other alternatives. If people are going to avoid seafood because of a concern around CO2, then you would hope they're not going to move to other environmentally damaging sources of protein. In the same way, we also don't want to have people moving to other, let's say, food choices which are perhaps less nutritionally valuable. So there's also some trade-offs there to make. Again, I'm not saying therefore environment should come at all costs, but these are indeed, I think, important points we need to start understanding our food in the context of, not just singular dimensions, if that makes sense.
Many more questions.
Good, they've warmed up.
Yes.
I have a question for the broader governance structure, because if you look at the law of the sea and the exclusive economic zones, do you think it's a bit outdated, or that it's actually a good framework to work with, because all the countries have the sovereign rights over there, 200 nautical miles, and you see like processes like the European Union buying access of third countries to go fish there, and I guess I read an article that it has like neo-colonial trends, so to say, that you can observe. Like, would you say it's kind of an outdated governance scheme, or do you think it's a good base to work with?
I think it's the best we've got to work with at this point, for sure. If you had to completely redesign something, I really wonder what that would be. If we really go back, and I think that's always a good thing to do, right? Let's go back to before the United Nations Law of the Sea was put in place. Then we had a 12 nautical mile range, right? And then all of those, everything that happened offshore, beyond that realm, was essentially open sea. There was Mare Liberum, developed by someone in this country, right? So this is really, that was an open access fishery completely, right? So I'm not saying that's what you're saying either, right? But that's a huge innovation in terms of trying to enclose further regions of the ocean for the benefits, right? That's the basis of it, first of all, for the benefit of the countries which own that part of the ocean, right? So if you go to the Pacific, for example, you see very small island states, but they love to call themselves big ocean states because the area of ocean that they're able to control through the establishment of that EEZ is considerable. So there are benefits associated, very direct benefits in terms of exclusion. And then I get to your question. Does that, I think, your question is whether that is the best way to also enable sustainable fishing, right? One of the interesting, let's talk about it in a multi-layered sense. So there's a national level right over that ocean, right? But there's also, in the case of fishing, there's different kinds of arrangements that are put in place. So we have regional fishery management organizations for transboundary stocks. So that's when you get into the tunas, for example, and other pelagic ocean swimming fish. And there we see all sorts of politics being played out. But overall, we have seen the emergence of what they call, in various RFMOs around the world, they refer to them differently, but conservation management measures, right? So without these internationally agreed upon measures, which transcend those EEZs, in fact, we wouldn't have any control over what those countries are doing within their EEZs. So there is a degree of control, and agreed upon control by the countries that have signed up. There's also, we can talk about, countries which have their coastal states, in fact, what they're called, right? So the countries that have that coastal areas, but there's also rules for flag states, right? So states which give their flag to the fishing vessels. So that's another way of governing and controlling what those vessels do, not just in terms of where they can access, but also their behavior of where they dock, where they unload their fish, for instance. We also have port regulations. So where a vessel lands, there are port state mechanisms in place which link to things like traceability and certification. So, not traceability is what I was trying to say. So those three things provide a complex multi-leveled system of rules where the aim is to try and essentially reduce the ability of fishing vessels to move beyond and get away with, let's say, unsustainable fishing. Now, all of that, I might add, is predicated on a faithful participation in that international regime, right? But we do also see that some countries are essentially not following by those agreed upon rules. And then we get into the same sorts of debates we have around climate change or any other global commons. And whether or not we can be effective there, well, we've seen huge gains, we have. Is it perfect? No. But that's also where other systems can come into place, whether that be certification, but also an EU, IUU regulation, for instance. That would play also another way of trying to create leverage over access to a market. So we've proposed in the past that there should be coastal states, flag states, port states, but also market states, recognising the leverage that those markets have over trying to create change. So again, it's not a perfect system, but there's a number of lever points that we have available to us in that international fisheries regime that have been demonstrated to lead to change, to not only identifying what conservation and management measures could be, but also making sure they're enforced. Is the picture solved? No, absolutely not. But is there progress? Well, yes, more or less, yes, there is. Okay, is there a long way to go? Also, there is, right? So it's an imperfect system, but it's a system that we're working with now, and it can create change. Does it mean we need to innovate more? Yeah, also. Yeah.
Can I go? Okay. Well, thank you for the lecture, first of all. But I wanted to ask, because I do agree that becoming vegan is not, let's say, the perfect solution either, because even if we were to stop eating fish tomorrow, it would obviously have other consequences, like you said. Same with if we were to stop all the flights tomorrow as well. So these drastic solutions have consequences. But for me, how I look at sustainability and fishing, sustainable fishing, is the scale of production and the mass production that we see in supermarkets and consumerism. So I was wondering how you see that changing, whether innovation is really the solution or whether it's the change of behavior in realizing that, okay, maybe we have to rethink our consumer behavior, and sometimes we can't get everything we want. Sometimes we should limit our seafood consumption to once a week, let's say, and see it more as a luxury than, an ordinary thing to do. So, I was just wondering about that.
Yeah. You trigger me at the end to think, okay, well, seafood, you're using the broad category again. I mean, if you eat seaweed every day and mussels every day, that would be a different statement than if you ate salmon every day, for example, right?
No, of course.
But just to tease you a bit, yeah. But the basic point I think you're talking about is overconsumption, right? So should we address overconsumption? Should we change behaviour so there is a greater awareness of what we consume has effects? Absolutely. Yes, I do think we should do that, right? And there you can talk about sort of more political consumerist moves, right, or movements. So, veganism, vegetarianism, pescatarianism, there's all sorts of ways in which people are trying to shape and create meaning for themselves around the behaviours that they have as a consumer. And all of those are really important, I think. And we do see shifts. I mean, it's a glib example I use, but I use it all the time because I've been asking a pretty consistent sample over the last 20 years or 17 years of my career. In a particular course, I ask, how many people here are vegetarian? 17 years ago, 20%. Today, well, let's do it right now. How many people here are vegetarian? About a bit less than half. Okay, you're not the same as the Wageningen students then? No, just teasing. But I've seen that number grow. So my point is that there are movements, and I don't want to associate it with universities because that's the identity politics I don't want to play into. But the idea of, that there is a greater awareness and that people can ascribe themselves certain lifestyle politics, I think is an important part of what it is to be a consumer, to be honest with you. But I want to just jump on very quickly a point you also said, this sort of industrial fishing, right? So you said it, so I'm going to use it as a bit of a hook to get into that discussion. So yes, today I was talking a lot about small scale and the values that small scale fishing has. But I can also put forward a proposition that industrial fishing isn't per se unsustainable. So there's a great example of this, right? In Australia, it was a Dutch flagged vessel. I forget the name of the vessel right now, but this was this mega trawler that went, was Dutch owned, Dutch flagged. Actually, I think it was flagged Irish flag, but it was Dutch owned. And it was fishing in the waters of Australia, and was essentially chased out of Australia because it was a mega trawler. That was something which, again, mediagenic response. There were lots of claims being made in the media by certain groups, by certain civil society groups, that this was unsustainable. There was no basis upon which that unsustainability was actually established. And if you look at where that fish was going, it wasn't going to luxury markets. This was fish that was going to go and have a contribution to food security in West Africa, in waters which, might be rather proud of this as an Australian, but yeah, indeed, there's some pretty solid fisheries management going on in Australia. They don't let anyone into those waters. So again, that case is one of those confounding examples of mega trawler being considered unsustainable, full stop, where that doesn't really reflect reality, and basically we're you could argue, even restricting nutrition being sent to other parts of the world as a result of that. So we have to be, again, critical, case by case, to work out what's going on in terms of sustainability, in terms of its contribution to food systems, including things like nutrition. And it's not simple to put it into broad categories. It really isn't. So I'm picking on you because you said it, but thank you for that.
Great, handing over the microphone yourself.
Yeah, one question. You had the diagram with the moving kind of all the data points. And you said it's basically good when it's at the 1 and 1, because that means that the fishing pressure and the biomass is kind of, I don't know, at equilibrium. I didn't really know. But does it mean that when it was before, more in the bottom right, that the biomass would like overproduce itself or like be multiplied, and that you actually, like, I was a bit thinking about the argument that many hunters sometimes do in terms of, oh, we actually need to intervene because otherwise it wouldn't be sustainable. And I was wondering whether you see something similar, or whether you think when we actually would stop any fishing, it would still like make a sustainable cause out of itself. And
it's a really good question. I'm not going to go too in depth with that because I'll be a little bit out of my depth, but you do see indeed, right, that there are these debates with trawler fisheries, for example, make this sort of statement, right, that if you trawl the bottom of the sea, it's like farming. You plough the ground, you release nutrients, that increases productivity, and there's been some evidence to show that's the case. But is that a long-term, is it a spike in nutrients which leads to an immediate response from the ecosystem, or is it a long-term, that there it starts to get a bit shaky, those kinds of statements, as I understand from my colleagues. But so that's part of your question. The other one is, I think that's the main question you had, right? So I think if you look at some fisheries, indeed, if you look at mussel banks, I know there you talk about disturbance, and disturbance can then spawn, let's say, can lead to increased productivity. That is the case in some instances, but I don't think that's the case for all fisheries by any stretch of the imagination. I think that was the main part of the question. In terms of the bottom right, it's not so much an overproduction of biomass, it's really just looking at, well, there is biomass. The point of that figure really is that there's biomass in the oceans. If we weren't fishing, full stop, there was no fishing going on, then biomass would be what the ecosystem determines biomass to be, right? And the whole point of those little letters next to the B and the F, right, the biomass and the fishing mortality, is maximum sustainable yield. And again, we can have a whole debate around that, but the basic idea is a graph that looks something like this, right? Then at that top point, you're still able to fish. There's also maximum economic yield. So whether sustainable yield is the same as economically viable yield is another question, but the peak of that figure is essentially what's represented by the middle of that figure, right? The top of a graph like this is what's represented there, that you can continue fishing, right, within certain bounds without the graph going all the way down again, that we don't create a negative spiral, let's say, in terms of biomass, and that system isn't able to reproduce itself. And of course, that's got everything to do with how much we want to increase or decrease the level of fishing pressure. That can be capacity, it can be days at sea, there's different measures for that. But that's the basic. It's a very simple figure, but it gives an indication that these are the basic sort of building blocks of working out how much fishing, how little fishing can we do in order to ensure that there's enough biomass that it reproduces itself, meaning above 1, right? Everyone knows these figures because you know what an R value is for COVID nowadays, right? It's the same thing, essentially, reproducing itself, more or less.
Maybe one more from the audience here in the room, and then I have another from the online audience.
So you talked about how this movie portrays like an apocalyptic scenario of the whole sea industry and the health of the sea, I would put it. And now when we hear you talk, you kind of recognize there's problems, but you're saying people are working on it. It's not as bad as they show it. So I wanted to ask you, like, if you recognize there's a crisis in the way things are working right now, or do you think what is being done right now is enough, and we can, like humans on the sidelines of this that are not directly involved in the industry, kind of like sit back and relax, and it's okay, what's being done is enough, and we can trust that the EU is doing enough, and we can trust that our governments are doing enough? or is it more of a real crisis that needs more drastic action?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and that's really the basis of it, isn't it? I mean, I'm not saying there are no problems, right? That's the first thing. Do I say that there's apocalypse, meaning there's just absolutely nothing we can do and it's inevitable, essentially, that it's all going to crash? Well, no, that's also not true, right? What I think, one of the elements I respond to, I think I can respond to your point, is that I think this comes back in a lot of instances in terms of a trust in institutions and also as citizens, right? And what sort of institutions do we want to trust in? And I think it's also good to recognise that as individuals, in a place like the Netherlands, you have choices as to which institutions you want to engage with when it comes to sustainability. And yeah, we can rely on the state, but if you put all your money on the state, yeah, I think there's reason to believe that they're not going to be able to solve everything all the time, right? So there's different other ways, of course, that we can start to take action. You can support civil society groups that are going to advocate, that already are advocating for change, many of which were actually already listed in this film. You can act as a consumer, as we've already talked about. I think there is a place for consumers within those markets. I don't think your particular action of buying a sustainable product will lead to wholesale change, but as aggregate, we can influence the way that buyers, especially, what role buyers play in terms of increasing transparency and putting requirements within their supply chains for whatever issue we want to talk about, and which indeed they're doing. So there are different ways in which we can engage with sustainability, and I don't think it's a matter of sitting on the couch. I think it's good that we become aware of what our field of action can be as individuals and push for change. So that's sort of a general way of responding to your question. I think really going to the next level in your question is, how can I be saying, which is a fair point, how can I be saying, well, it's not apocalyptic, but there are still issues, so what can we really do about it? Well, I think what I'm trying to say really here is that there is a thing called the sustainable seafood movement, right? There is, and it's been busy for the last 20 years in trying to create change within the industry, and there have been huge gains made within the industry in terms of sustainability. But are we at the point where we would all like to be? Well, no, we're not. But I don't think a film like this is giving any credit to the huge gains that have been made thus far, and also the trajectory that a lot of those initiatives put us on for making further improvements. And when I have in the back of my ear, right, the colleague who said to me, this film put us back 20 years because they've been fighting, gaining trust, working within these private companies, right, trying to get them to sign up to all sorts of CSR agreements, helping them to make the decisions often they want to make. And I really mean that. There are companies, CEOs of companies I've spoken to as well, that are constrained, whether it be by their financial arrangements or their buyers, that they're unable to make these kinds of changes that they also see as necessary in order to persist with their own business. But with the advent of the sustainable seafood movement, more opportunities emerge to be discussing the ways in which change can occur. So again, it's the counterfactual for me, right? Would we be better off if there was none of those organisations weren't doing anything or as bad as what we're talking about? It would be a disaster, I think, right? We need those organisations in place to continue a process of change. I don't know if I'm answering your question now. I've got off track, but I hope that gives you some kind of insight as to where I'm at. And when it comes to the science that I do, it's fundamentally on this, right? It's, yes, we're not perfect, but we need to work out ways in which we can continue to improve, in this case, seafood production, right? Or any food production, or even climate. We need to have institutions which we interact with, financial institutions, state institutions, market institutions, and they don't exist without us either. That's an important part of being a sociologist interested in transformative change, that we do play a role, but how we play a role and the means by which we play a role becomes a site of innovation in my mind, and that innovation is by no means over yet.
Thank you. There were some other questions, but we are running out of time. I will ask the final question from the online audience, but if you have questions, maybe they can come up here.
Always, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so after the lecture, you can ask your questions anyway. So I have one final question by Elena Costa Prado, beautiful name as well. You mentioned the impact of Seaspiracy around the globe, but what's the strategy to address this impact? Because how can we expect people to engage with facts and not with emotions when the topic is so complex?
You said a beautiful name. It's a beautiful question.
Yeah.
I think she might have stumped me.
Is there a strategy?
It's a good question. A strategy in terms of this film, I think the strategy is what I'm doing right now. And I see all my colleagues, scientific colleagues, I see them doing all sorts of the very similar things all around the world. The Blue Food Assessment is designed. It wasn't developed because of Seaspiracy, but all the questions we get from the media are, but you guys are saying this, but we've just watched this film, Seaspiracy. Most of my interviews start with exactly that sentence. So then I say, well, okay, you've seen the film, what we are saying, and then I go into some of the results of the Blue. I just had an interview this morning that was the same. So that's all we can do, I think, and I'm talking as a scientist, that we can, try to speak truth. I don't like that term because there is no single truth in a sense, because it's a moving target. But our current knowledge, all we can do is present where the current knowledge is and how that current knowledge is addressing the issues, right? Where we see that there have been gains. And I hear my own voice sometimes, coming to your question. Sometimes I think, am I going too far? Am I being an advocate for something here? Well, I don't think I am, but I'm trying to bring balance to the discussion, right? That's the important thing. I'm not trying to say that seafood is fine, that everyone should eat as much fish as they want, the industry's got nothing to answer for. That's not the point. The point is to try and bring balance, right? And to hold account where there are statements made that are not very accurate. But the emotional thing, that comes to a broader sort of discussion around this point I raised in one of my earlier slides around polarization and division. Does a film like this and the solutionism that it puts, this sort of simple solutionism that it subscribes to, does that enable for productive discussions in society, right? And that's a very general statement, I know, but I think it's an important one. Or does it put people into certain boxes? Does it put walls between people because the fishing industry is not going to talk to the NGO because of that film? Because, and then we get into a much broader phenomena that is really also within the scientific community creating all sorts of interesting discussions, even to the extent of almost, what is our role as science, right? If we see decisions being made which has no reference to the body of work that we're developing, we need to get better at communication, but I don't think it's only communication that we need to get better at, right? And what that something else is, that's stumping a lot of us at the moment. But I think the basis of it really should be, making sure we think critically about what we're seeing and not just swallowing the pill of whatever pill that might be on that particular day that's on our smartphone. It's not an adequate answer, but that's all I've got.
Also opening the debate, as you did today.
Yeah, maintaining the debate too, yeah.
Thank you very much for today's lecture, for all the answers to the audience's questions. Have a good evening, all of you, and join us for other lectures and events.
Thanks very much.